Energy Transmutation, Between-ness and Transmission by Richard Rose. Section, Energy and Between-ness. Energy is the result of interaction or tension. Energy results from the mere proximity of dissimilar substances, as in the case of different metals and the resultant galvanic action. Energy results from the proximity of two different types of human protoplasms, insomuch that ulceration or rejection of tissue results. Energy results, sometimes favorably and sometimes unfavorably, every time two animal bodies come in contact with each other. It has been suggested that all early life forms resulted from the energy which occurred at the edge of the sea or other body of water, from which edges it spread both ways, deeper into the sea and farther onto the landmass. The civilization that we have today was a result of betweenness, for it all sprang from the action between the land and the water. Of course, the action was complex and became increasingly complex as forms resulted. It has been said that all of life was created by a supreme being. But even if this is so, that supreme being chose a method that was gradual and gradated, and was not done in the twinkling of an eye, meaning a human eye. Complexity breeds complexity, as has been explained in the writings about the law of complexity. With new complexities come new opportunities for betweenness of a more complex and almost miraculous nature. The moon passed over the shoreline, and the betweenness or polarity of the earth and moon was effective on the water, as it seems to be on most fluids. The result was an ebbing and flowing of tide, giving more surface to that part of the sea that is the most productive for plant life. We find that the moon is suspected of having an influence on human behavior, whether because of its effect on body fluids in general or particular, subtle fluids that are located in the spinal sheath and brain. Believers in astrology go a step further and argue that every planet affects us to some degree, if it is visible to us. Energy is the result of polarity, which is a more scientific way of saying betweenness. However, polarity is taken to signify electricity, or at least it might leave the impression of that all phenomena of betweenness are measurable electrically. There is a powerful force that keeps things together. It is that balance between centripetal and centrifugal forces, between the tendency to grow and the ever-present tendency to collapse. This balance does not seem to be connected to electricity. There is manifestly a tension, a balanced pull and repelling process that maintains the positions of planets and suns in relation to each other. It can be called many things, this tension. Electromagnetic field, or gravity versus centrifugal force if rotating, or polarity with a nearby body. If we take the tension of magnetic force, we find that the peak force lies halfway between the two poles of a magnet. This, of course, presumes that the magnetic force of both poles is equal, so that if we place two magnets some distance apart and place a metal object between, that metal object will remain at rest if we can place it at the exact middle point of the intervening distance. Again, this presumes that the magnets are of the same force and size. If we place two horseshoe magnets or polar magnets opposite one another, with the opposite pole opposite the positive pole of the other, and the negative opposite the negative pole of the other, and these two magnets are placed in a trough or a channel so that they cannot flip over or move to one side in order to make proper contact, those two magnets will repel one another when forced together, and they will create a space between them. And the repulsion distance is related to the gravitational pull or weight of the magnets plus the friction of the two magnets in the channel or trough. Now, all of this is well known to every grade school student, but the reason for the emphasis here lies in the previous lack of observation of this midpoint as being the high point of force. An electrical spark leaps across a set of points as in a spark plug. The source of energy is overloaded and can afford to lose or eject or reject some energy. There's a distance that's too close and a distance that's too far for the proper effect of the spark, so that the energy of the spark may be a force that could be channeled into new directions, other than just an electrical current flowing from one place to another. By new directions, I mean the spark is used to activate the gasoline. Tension is brought about by finding the proper spark gap. Force results, and from a seemingly inert gallon of gas, a car may move its weight and contents 30 miles down the road. Now, if this same analogy is carried over to the planetary magnetism, it is possible that there is a stream field of force midway between the heavenly bodies, besides there being just a place of gravity neutrality by virtue of the relations of planetary mass to gravitational power. Of course, this is just idle speculation in passing and has no great bearing on the message here. But the speculation, for what it's worth, is that the most awesome force in the universe would lie there, and that force might be trapped. However, our main concern here is in the analysis of life and the formulation to some clumsy degree of, 1, an explanation of transmutation of energy, and 2, the transmission of more subtle essences. We look at very primitive forms of life and find that a ketone enzyme has been created, or accidentally formed, after the accidental reaction of certain inert inorganic compounds. In other words, from inorganic hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, and perhaps nitrogen, I do not know the formula, came a primitive virus, a ketone enzyme, or some complicated molecule chain bearing the seeds of all future life. Life is tension at work. Life is a force which results from less sophisticated elements in interaction. The result of interaction of two or more lesser agents, or life forms, is new form. Life constantly creates forms. Inertia, death, removes them. We will come to this in detail later. The sun, being a vast body perhaps at its peak of interaction, and being to some degree able to focus some of its energy upon the earth, was, and is, able to play a tremendous role in the evolution of plants and animals from their most primitive forms. The energy of the sun is focused to the extent that we are in that safe midpoint, which is neither so hot as to destroy us, nor so cold as to forbid molecular reaction. Our existence results from the magic of betweenness. And so, with the sun and many other factors of betweenness, many forms of life appeared on Earth, and these forms began to interact, even as the inert elements had interacted before them. And with each new form of life that resulted from the energy of this interaction, a more subtle life form was developed. We see a pattern evolving again and wonder if there is a supreme intelligence engineering the whole thing. It seems too infinitely complex for sheer chance. The primitive protozoans and one-celled plants become the food of creatures that are somewhat larger or more sophisticated in design and diverse as to function. Some plants become huge and kill off lesser plants with their shade. Some plants kill other plants just by being near them and prosper by the fertility left by the dead plants. The worm eats tiny life forms and is eaten by birds and moles and even hogs, which are more sophisticated. The birds and moles have to learn to survive, despite the presence of snakes, cats, dogs, and other seemingly useless animals. However, without these seemingly useless animals, the bird would overproduce, become runted and diseased, and approach inertia as a species. The bird is caught between the desire to rest, eat, and play, and its implanted survival motivation. We might presume that the predators, if they do nothing else, keep the bird and the other game on their toes, and at the same time ensure at least some maintenance of alertness, intelligence, and consciousness. We come now to the human, the chief predator. Omnivorous, but highly specialized. He is, unfortunately, highly scornful of all his many parent forms that preceded him and still support him in some degree or other. We look out the window at this point and observe the world as a sorrowful slaughterhouse, a place of blood and carnage, wherein the most noble efforts of nature and the whole system of tension lead and evolve only to semen, blood, and blockheads. It is not that bad, however. For one thing, it cannot be any other way. If we take away the carnage, we take away the magical secret of the fountain of life, which has come a long way from the virus on the seashore. Man would not evolve physically, economically, mentally, or spiritually without his constant state of tension. And his constant overall state of tension is made up of myriad factor states of tension. His consciousness is the most complex of all the animal kingdom, and he can design the intelligent quotient tests that flatter him twice. First, with a fictitious number that is always higher than other animals, and secondly, with the assured conceit that he can measure intelligence. It is my conviction that the animal may be superior to the human in being more aware of his state of being. However, the animal cannot verbalize to us or to other animals any feeling that it might have about its relation to the source from which all awareness emanates. Man has to tell himself by telling his neighbors, even as I am doing now. The animal is aware of its isness. Man belabors himself to learn to talk, to develop an alphabet, and then to confuse himself with the babble of word meanings and meaninglessness. The animal simply feels, exudes its feelings, and its sensitive fellow animals pick it up. We must retrace our steps a bit and take note of the change of energy that takes place in the human, which is not present in the animal. By the same token, the rate of evolution has been more rapid in the human than in the other animals. This has mainly been because man has been able to survive the usual adversities that might be labeled factors of tension, which generate some force, and besides that, has artificially created other conditions of irritation and tension that have provoked force by far out of proportion to any force that stimulates the members of lesser animal kingdoms. In social relationships, man has made an increasingly complex game of life. His councils and congresses are forever dreaming up new rules to the game so that the survivors must, with each generation, be more astute than the last. More children are committing suicide, faced with the appalling odds, which indicates to their sensitive intuitions that the game is so complex and so unrewarding that it just is not worth playing. If they do not commit suicide, which is the trend of our lemming civilization, they separate themselves from society and try to look for the necessity for life itself. In other words, the time has come for most of us to see if it is worth the effort. And strangely enough, when we embark upon this path of self-definition, we are thrown back upon our relative nature again, and we find that we can only learn or transcend this state or find a better or more real state by utilizing those same force vectors that led us up to and into present complexity and confusion. It has been said that God is simple, but man would like to make him complex. Man has the urge to be theatrical, to assume that God is infinite complexity because man is infinitely more complex than a grain of sand or amoeba. Somehow man must find a way to stop, for a few minutes at least, the whole machinery of complexity that dominates his attention and consumes his energy. Man, being the king of all beasts, would have grown soft if he did not find something that preyed upon man. So tribal wars developed, and as these became traditional, man had no further need for stimulation. However, out of warfare itself, most of man's technology seems to evolve. And with that new technology, new trades and social ramifications sprang up. Man went through many different scenes of confrontation with opposites, and as he emerged from these tests, he took with him new force, new capacity for pressure, and the new pressure hurried his mental evolution. At one time, man merely killed, ate, reproduced, and died or was killed. When he began to farm, he became caught between the attraction to the old way of life and the necessity for change. He survived and came up with new energy. He developed foods that could be stored for long periods of time, which gave him leisure time to develop a still better technology and to dissipate more. At first, he plowed his corn with a bow strapped to his body to protect his garden from savages and wild game. He learned to tame animals for their milk and meat, and he also learned how to make alcohol. It would be interesting to know when man's sex habits began to find the wide variance with animal sex patterns. It must be presumed that primitive man was required to function sexually about the same as an ape or monkey. Attention to other things most certainly took some of the inclination away from the seasonal sex habits. In other words, the sex frequency of animals is not continuous, as in the case with humans, because most animals have periods in which they reproduce, followed by periods in which they are sexually inactive. I've mentioned in previous papers that some animals that are close to man or that resemble man seem to copy man's lack of respect for sexual seasons. The cow, which has the same gestation period as the human female, will not tolerate any attention from the bull after conception occurs and until a considerable time after the birth of the young. This makes the cow's sexual frequency about once every 11 months, in a life that lasts only 6 or 8 years. On the other hand, the female human would think nothing of daily sexual activity in a life that may last 70 years, of which 70, at least 50 years, would see that same frequency maintained if the opportunity lasted that long. This should tell us something. Man takes from other plants and animals a great variety of foods. Many of these foods are more complex or have more subtle substances than are produced by animals beneath them on the scale of complexity and specialization of structure. For instance, man prefers the milk of the cow to that of the members of the cat family. He prefers the meat of herbivores to that of carnivores, finding the meat of the rabbit more delicate and subtle in texture and taste than the meat of the skunk or of the fox. There's an upward spiral in the evolution of animals towards the production of more subtle protoplasm, eventually climaxing in man with a body that contains the most subtle nervous system and brain of all animals. So man takes the cream from all the animals and plants. He produces almost like a robot and wastes more carelessly than any animal more subtle protoplasm than 100 bulls or 300 cows. And the wasted protoplasm may exceed his body weight by 5 or 6 times. Of course, a cow gives a lot of milk, which she would not give if man were not so demanding. But nature originally planned her to produce only enough for her offspring. We are faced with the prospect that man is not the last step in the ladder of energy absorption. If we conclude that the production of milk is aimed at human betterment, if we conclude that chickens are allowed to exist in greater numbers and under greater protection than wild fowls because they furnish food for humans, then it can be concluded that all such animals depend for their existence upon the type of food that they supply for mankind. And it can be then concluded also that they manifestly have little value apart from their value as food for others. We get the picture of the whole animal world being channeled into a controlled existence for the betterment of the human diet, or for labor or protection for the human, as in the case of the cow, dog, and horse. The buffalo is encouraged to disappear, except as a museum piece, because he's not as tractable as a beef cow and does not produce both milk and meat. The predators are only allowed to exist where it pleases the ecologists to find them useful in thinning out game which man does not wish to eat, or which is too difficult to catch in a planned fashion. We come now to a proposition. If animals are judged to exist only for human food or energy, then it is proper to suppose that humans may be encouraged or allowed to live because of their energy service to a strategically superior type of being. I use these words strategically superior because there's no evidence to prove that the things which are parasitical towards us are superior. They are just able to get away with it by being able to function in the overall plan of nature and by being able to catch us in a state of betweenness. The state of betweenness in this final instance is the catch between man's ability to produce tremendous quantities of energy and his inability to do any engineering work on the human direction of subtle human energy. It might be said also that man is caught between a tremendous fountain of energy and an undefined bit of programming towards inertia, death, through dissipation. This dissipation might well be the bearing of energy in a very subtle form to other invisible entities. This brings us full turn to the age-old belief by sages and saints that man is the victim of invisible entities, demons, incubi, succubi, elementals, or even souls of the deceased. And men, sages and saints, were firmly convinced of this long before they knew anything about electrical polarity or the microscopic beginnings of life forms. If mankind has a purpose, and if science refuses to admit that man has a spiritual essence, then man's purpose must be related to the place he takes and fills and the natural balance in the total balanced aquarium of life, not just the visible or evident picture of animal life. So that if man is host to parasites that are invisible to the best microscopes of man, such as the virus that is known by its results, and if these parasites are accepted as being real by the scientific world, then it is indeed possible that there are yet other undiscovered or unphotographed parasites that might be living at man's expense. I can see no other explanation for the huge expenditure of energy. The laws of energy point out that energy is not lost in any chemical or physical interaction. It must go somewhere. Some of the mystics of bygone eras, such as Paracelsus, maintain that such entities did exist, and those mystics proceeded to name and categorize them. Furthermore, they claim that these entities were visible to some clairvoyant people. The older religious writings lead us to believe that these entities were considered to be evil, that is, designed to do damage to the spiritual life of mankind. It is possible that they are symbiotic as regards human life. It is also possible that we are like the chickens in the pen or the cow in the pasture. We may have become so dependent upon their stimulus that we have become slaves to the momentary pleasure with which we are baited. The function of such an entity would supposedly be to make effective the implants of curiosity and desire so that we would not fail to reproduce. The entity, however, is only concerned with the energy exuded and lost in dissipation, and consequently man is allowed to dabble in forms of energy loss that are denied lesser animals. Regardless of the probableness of the above postulation as to superhuman parasites, it is evident that man produces infinitely more energy than is needed to survive and reproduce. It behooves us, in the event that we wish to remain skeptical, to find out the reason for this energy waste. We cannot excuse it by saying that man enjoys. It should be evident by now to most readers of these notes that man is consumed while thinking he is consuming. We find that sex is not a mighty prerogative and divine exercise by a semi-divine being, franchised by a fully divine being, so that man may gorge himself on the apples of pleasure from all trees but one. We find that sex is a trap and yet a necessity. And if we can find that focal point whereby we can remain untrapped and yet functioning enough to fulfill the necessity, we may unleash still another new force out of that highly specialized form of tension.